Hi, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Avery. I've been learning sign language for the last couple of years, and it has sparked my interest in discovering more about the social attitudes, perspectives, and beliefs about the deaf community. Now, I could start with telling you about the first deaf person recorded in history, Quintus Pedius, in 44 BC. But nobody really knows much about him, and that isn't a very exciting introduction. Instead, I'm going to begin with someone you probably already know, Helen Keller. But before I say anything, I want you to think. What are your first thoughts that come to mind about her? You probably recalled that she was blind and deaf, maybe that she learned how to communicate despite these things. You also probably think positively of her, or maybe you see her as an inspiration of some sort. However, all of these thoughts are just one perspective of her that has been spread throughout history and across modern society. None of us knew her personally, and unless you've really done your research, you probably don't know too much more about her other than what I talked about. Don't worry, I'm not here to tell you that Helen Keller was secretly a horrible person. As far as I know, she was everything we know her to be. All of this is just to say that social influences are powerful and thought patterns are easily spread throughout society. In the case of Helen Keller, these attitudes and beliefs reflect positively on the deaf community. But I want to take you through some other instances in history where social attitudes and behaviors have impacted the deaf community in other ways. Let's start with religion in this case, because religious attitudes really impacted the deaf community historically and still today. The Bible is one religious text I'm sure you're all familiar with just from living in America. And it stresses the idea that anyone with a physical or mental disability has a defect. And if man has a defect, quote, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and the holy. Only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar, because he has a defect. Lest he profane my sanctuaries, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. This passage, which comes from Leviathan 21, shows that deaf people are seen as lesser than in the eyes of God. Additionally, deaf people were also excluded from Christianity because they could not, quote, hear the word of God. This is an idea just rooted in ableism, and it also caused hearing people to accept the perspective that because deaf people are not made in God's image, they are below hearing people and they are lower in society and they should be excluded from religion. Consequently, these perspectives impacted the self-esteem and the self-identity of deaf people because they felt that no matter what they could do, they couldn't gain God's approval and they couldn't gain the approval of the religious community, which was a large percent of the population at the time. Additionally, religion gave people hope, but this hope was stolen from deaf people no matter what they did. Unfortunately, it wasn't just like this with Christianity. This was a common belief across many religions at the time. Deaf people were seen as lesser than, and an example of this comes from the Quran. Indeed, the worst kind of all beasts in the sight of Allah are the people who are deaf and dumb and do not understand. This comes from verse 822, and it is a good example of how deaf people were not just discriminated against in Western culture. This was a global thing, and it transcended across religions. But I do think that the Quran seems to give deaf people the connotation of, like, beasts, evil, or malicious. Whereas Christianity, or at least the passage that I saw from the Bible, and the majority of my research led me to believe that deaf people were more seen as stupid and uneducated and incapable of comprehending the Word of God. I think it's interesting to see this stark contrast between the way that deaf people are portrayed in different religions, because even though deaf people are not frequently portrayed well in religion, the connotation is quite different, and I think there's a lot to discuss there. But I do want to switch gears now and talk about Alexander Graham Bell, the oralism movement, and the start of deaf community and education in the United States. In the hearing world, Alexander Graham Bell is remembered as the inventor of the telephone and not much more. But he was actually really significant in the deaf community, so we're going to talk about that. Alexander Graham Bell was born in the 1800s to a normal family, hearing parents. He was hearing. However, some point throughout his childhood, Alexander's mom became deaf, and it is thought that this influenced his behaviors and feelings and attitudes towards deaf people because he was able to compare his mom before she lost her hearing to afterwards. And he could see that she faced more challenges with independence and communication after she lost her hearing. After his mom went deaf, Alexander started studying a little bit more about deafness, and somewhere along these lines, he decided, not through any research or empirical findings, but he decided that deafness is genetic and it can only be passed down